Okay, so the first thing we're going to do with the template is we're going to select the actual bank format for that template, because the template, once you select that template and you import the bank statement, then the RecXpress is going to know exactly which bank format is expected, because the template will then indicate that that is the bank format you're importing. So let's add a new template here, and I'm just going to add a template called NAB, which happens to be the National Australian Bank, which is our first bank format off our list. So you would then select your bank format off your list, and then you will add that bank format to that rules template. Now what will happen when you add that particular bank format to the rules template is when you select that template, when you import your bank statement, it knows exactly which format to expect, because the National Australian Bank format will obviously have a different record layout to any of the other bank formats. But because you've now selected that format for this rules template, it knows that when you import the bank statement for this rules template, that is the record layout of that bank format that it will be importing. Secondly, in the rules template, we will then set up the various rules on how those entries on the bank statement should be generated through to a Cashbook batch. Now when you add the bank format to a rules template, like I've just done, and I've selected the Save button, you will see that all the transaction codes that were submitted to us at the time of developing that bank format, we would have added to that bank format, and we would have grouped it into these default categories that you can see in your Finder when you select the categories. So these are the default categories, and we would then group those transaction codes in these default categories. That is purely to give you a starting point when you start setting up your own categories and setting up your own rules. Now, you don't have to stick to these default categories. The categories that you are going to be creating for your default rules template is completely user-defined. You can delete these default categories if you want, and you can add your own categories. The categories are purely there that when you set up all your rules for a particular bank format, in order to group those rules into smaller groupings so they're easier to access and easier to work with. Because when you're dealing with very big bank reconciliations, you could easily have a couple of hundred rules that you would add to your template, because the more rules you add, the more entries you could then automatically generate off your bank statement through to the Cashbook batch. Now, if you're working with a couple of hundred rules, it might become cumbersome for you to access a particular rule if you want to edit a rule, or to find a rule if you want to delete a rule, or if you want to find a specific place to add a rule. So that is why we allow you to create these categories, so that you can group your rules into categories that make sense to that particular bank statement reconciliation. And that is completely up to the user what they want to call those categories, how many categories they want, and how they want to group their rules. Now, there's one category that is different, and that is the category Other. So if I select the category Other here, you will see that for the category Other, you cannot set up rules for that category. That is the only category that's different, and that's the only category that you cannot delete. So if you select delete now, it's going to ask you, do you want to delete the entire rules template? So if I select delete there, you can see, are you sure you want to delete template code NAB and all its associated categories? The reason you cannot delete the category Other.
Mike, sorry, is the categories predefined? Will you click on the magnifying glass first, please?
Sure.
I just want to have a look at...
Those categories are just the default. Yeah.
Okay.
They're just broad categories, Elder, and they're purely there so that when you add a particular bank format, you have a starting point. So if we know the transaction code is a check, or the transaction code is a bank charge, or is a
Perfect.
Forex transaction. We will then put it into that category.
Yeah.
But you can
You can
then,
add in the...
yes, you can then move it out of that category into your own categories that you've created, that particular transaction code if you want to, or you can even delete those categories. You don't even have to keep them, and then start adding your own categories. It's purely
Super.
It's purely to give you a starting point and also to illustrate the point of what a category basically is, because we would have put those in there. And if you're happy with those categories, sure, use them and then add your rules to those transaction codes in that categories. But you really, I mean, it's completely user defined except for the category other. Now,
Okay, perfect.
now why would that category other be different? Okay, so the reason it's different is when we import the bank statement, these rules that we're going to set up now, it will cycle through all these rules and it will start applying the rules to the bank statement entries. And once we set up the rule, I'm going to explain how it knows which rule to apply to which bank statement entry. So we will get to that. But at this point, as it imports the bank statement, it will apply all the rules to the bank statement entries. And for those bank statement entries to which it cannot apply a rule, in other words, none of the rules that you have set up, the identification criteria in those rules, which you're going to be doing next, was met in that bank statement transaction. Those bank statement transactions to which no rules could be applied would then be placed in the category other. So we've reserved that category to put those bank statement entries in to which no rule applies, so that after you've imported the bank statement, you can then display category other and only the bank statement entries to which no rules could be applied will be displayed, and that affords you then the opportunity to then add rules to those bank statement entries. And of course, as soon as you add a rule to the bank statement entry, then it will be moved from category other to whichever category that particular rule belongs in. So that's the only category that's different, other. All the others is completely user defined. Now let's look at our categories and how we set them up. Now the first thing you would do is you would select your new icon and then you would put a category name in. And then you would give your category a description in this field here. Then you can also assign an auto-numbering sequence to that category. Now what does the auto-numbering sequence mean? Let me explain. If you generate these entries without using an auto-numbering sequence, it will use the reference of the bank statement entry as the reference that is assigned to the entry when it's generated to the Cashbook batch. So if you want to use the bank statement reference, then you would place your rule in a category where you have not selected the auto-numbering sequence. Okay, so if you haven't selected the auto-numbering sequence there, then that category will not have an auto-numbering sequence for the entire category. And at this stage, I just want to go back to our sample, because that is the one we are going to be using, our sample data. So for our category bank charges, when you look at the bank charges on your bank statement, you will see that those bank charges come through with a very long numeric reference. And that numeric reference is a reference that's generated by the bank's internal system to generate the bank charge to the customer's account. Now that numeric reference means very little to the actual customer. So if they were to use that reference of the bank statement entry, when they generate their bank charges entries to a Cashbook batch, then that reference will be the reference that feeds through to the Cashbook bank reconciliation and of course to their general ledger bank charges account. It might make much better sense for them to assign their own numbering sequences for a category like bank charges, because then they can assign their own prefix and their own numbering sequence to their bank charges, And when their bank charges are generated through to the Cashbook batch and to the GL account, then they will have numbering sequences that they have decided upon that make sense to them, and it runs in a sequence rather than those numeric values that appear in the reference of the bank statement entry for bank charges. Now, the way the auto-numbering sequences work is you can assign it to the category, and then all the rules you assign in that particular category. If the particular rule in the category in the auto number field is set to no, and it belongs to a category where the auto numbering sequence box is selected, then it will use the auto numbering sequence in the category, in this header section of the category, for that particular entry when it's generated. If you have a rule within a category and you want to assign a different numbering sequence to that particular rule in the category, then you can select auto number yes, and then on the rule you can enter your prefix and your next sequence number, which means if the rule has auto number set to yes, it will use the prefix and the next sequence number on the rule to generate the reference for that entry in the Cashbook batch. If the rule has auto number set to no, it will then check if the category's got an auto numbering sequence. If it does, it will use the auto numbering sequence of the category because that rule belongs to that category. And it will then use that as the auto numbering sequence when the entry is generated through to the Cashbook batch. If you want to use the reference on the bank statement, then you will create a category without selecting the auto number tick box, and in the auto number field you would leave it as no. So it will check there's no auto number on the rule and there's no auto number selected for the category, so use the reference of the bank statement entry as the reference that's generated for the Cashbook entry. And that's how the auto numbering sequences work. So you have the option to use the bank statement reference or the reference of your category or the reference of your individual rule. Okay, so you can set it up for your auto numbering sequences in that fashion. Now let's look at the actual rule. Now the rule has two sections to it. The first section of the rule is set up to identify the bank statement entry. And the second part of the rule is just the allocation details of how that entry should be generated through to the Cashbook batch. Now let's look at the first part first. Those identification criteria we're going to be setting up. Now, it stands to reason before we can apply the rule to a bank statement entry, we first need to know which bank statement entry we are working with. And that is why we set up the identification criteria. Now, there's three fields you can use to identify the bank statement entry. The first field is the transaction code. Now, the transaction code always has to match. So that is your primary identification mode for your bank statement entry. So the transaction code in the rule has to match the transaction code of the bank statement entry that's being imported for the rule to apply to that bank statement entry. Now, when you have a bank format, we will add all the transaction codes to that bank format when we develop the bank format, because we get the record layout of the bank format and we get a transaction code list. And we will then add all the transaction codes to that particular bank format. But there is no guarantee that the transaction code list that was submitted to us when we developed the format is a completely comprehensive transaction code list. We are reliant on yourselves and your customers to request a new bank format from us and to provide us with that information that the customer will request from their bank. The bank will not give it to Peresoft because you have to be a customer of the bank to get that information. So we take the transaction code and we add all the transaction codes to that bank format. But we don't know if it's a comprehensive list. We will add everything we have. And secondly, the bank might go and add additional transaction codes to that format after we've developed the format. So what we've done is we've given the user the ability to add their own transaction codes. And that you do in your RecXpress setup, RecXpress transaction codes. And in there you can select any of your bank formats. Let's select our National Australian Bank, seen that we worked with that before. And you can see with the National Australian Bank format, we have a 3-digit numeric transaction code. Now you can see these are all the transaction codes that we added when we developed this particular format. Now if you see a transaction code on your bank statement that is not part of this list of transaction codes for this particular bank format, you can then come in here, select the bank format, hit your insert key, and you can then add your transaction code. And you can see here I'm adding an additional transaction code to bank charges, and then you can allocate it to one of your default categories here. And I can now save it. What I've now effectively done is I have now added that additional transaction code, and I will now be able, in my rules template for that particular bank format, I'll be able to select that transaction code and set up a rule for that transaction code. By doing it this way, you know for certain that the user can add each and every transaction code that appears on their bank statement. They can come and add themselves, and they can set up a rule for each and every transaction code that they might want to set up a rule for on their bank statement. So there is no reason that they cannot set up a rule for a particular bank statement entry because they can add the transaction codes themselves. Now that's the first and primary identification mode. Then the second field you can use as your identification criteria is the description that comes through for the bank statement entry. Now, if you only want to use the transaction code, then in your compare method field here, you can select none. And bank charges might be a good example once again, because you might have one bank charges account that you set up in your GL for this particular bank code in Cashbook, and all your bank charges entries will be allocated to that particular bank charges GL account code, and your transaction codes that identifies the bank statement entry as a bank charge might be sufficient to identify the entry as a bank charge, and you don't need any other fields apart from the transaction code to identify that entry as a bank charge. Then in your compare method, you can select none, which means you don't want to use the description in addition to the transaction code to identify that particular bank statement entry. Now that might work well for bank charges, but for a category like stop order, that's going to be a completely different scenario. Because for your stop orders, which is automatic payments that you've authorized the bank to run on your behalf, the transaction code might identify the bank statement entry as a stop order. But each of those automated payments, which we call stop orders, is going to go to a different GL expense account, or it might even go to a vendor, a different vendor in accounts payable that you want to allocate against the vendor account. So the transaction code will not be enough to differentiate all the different stop order entries on the bank statement from each other, so you can apply different rules to those various stop orders that appear on your bank statement. So in addition to the transaction code, you will then use your description. And if you're going to use your description, we give you the following statements that you can use. You can use equal, which means you know the exact description for that particular bank statement entry, and every time that bank statement entry appears on the bank statement, it has that exact description and the description doesn't change. You can then select equal, and whichever character string you then enter in the compare description field, the same character string, if it appears on your bank statement entry, and that's character for character, if it matches it, then this rule will be applied to that particular bank statement entry. So as long as that transaction code and that exact description matches. But of course, not all the entries on your bank statement will have an exact description that is exactly the same every time it appears on the bank statement. And that's why you have another statement to use, and that is the like statement. Now the like statement is like a contain statement. It means that whichever character string you enter in here, as long as that character string is anywhere within the bank statement entry description, then it will identify that bank statement entry and the rule will be applied to the bank statement entry. So in that entire description field of 60 characters, as long as this character string is somewhere within that field, then the rule will be applied, which makes it a lot more lenient in identifying the entry. And of course, most of your bank statement entries will have a part of the description, not the entire description field, that will remain the same. And that's why you would then use the like statement, which is the contain statement. It means this character string must be contained somewhere in the description. We also, with those two statements, give you wildcard characters. So if you selected the equal, the principle remains the same. It means that that exact description must be matched, but you can replace certain characters within that character string with a wildcard character. And the same with the like statement. You can add a wildcard character. So let's use an example here. Let's say we want to pick up this compare description, but it doesn't always come through as XZIDE. Sometimes the X is replaced by another character. Then what we would do is we would put a question mark, which is the wildcard character, where the X is, and the D is also not a constant. It's a variable, so we put the question mark on the D. So now, in that description of the bank statement entry, as long as the E is followed by any character, is followed by the C, I, any character E, it will still match that bank statement entry to the rule because we've used those wildcard characters. Okay, and that's how you would use the wildcard characters in your description if certain characters within the description that you want to use changes on your bank statement, but others remain constant. And then finally, there's a third field that we use in our identification criteria, and that field is the statement amount field. Now, if you leave that statement amount field as 0.00, it will then not use that field as part of the identification criteria. If, however, your bank statement entry comes through with the same amount every time on the bank statement, and it is going to be useful to use the amount to differentiate that particular bank statement entry from the other bank statement entries by amount, then you can enter the statement amount in the statement amount field. And only if that particular bank statement entry is the same transaction code, the same description that we've set up in the description field, and the statement amount is the same as the statement amount value in our rule, then will that entry be applied to this rule. Okay, so those are the three field criteria we can use. And that then, yes,
sorry, Mike, if it's a variable amount, would you rather than leave that at 000?
Absolutely. If it's a variable amount, you must leave it 000, because if that amount changes and it's not the same as the amount you've entered in the statement amount field, then the rule will not be applied to that entry.
Okay.
Now the second part of the rule is purely, once we have applied the rule to the entry, to provide RecXpress with the information that is required to generate that entry to the Cashbook batch. So the rest of the entry, you will see all the fields that you are used to entering in a Cashbook batch when you enter a Cashbook batch entry. The first one is your entry description. Now, if you leave the entry description field blank in your rule, it will then use the entry description of the bank statement entry. So if blank, use bank statement entry description. If there is a value in the entry description field of the rule, then use that as the description for your Cashbook batch entry that's generated. Okay, so you can set up your own description, or you can leave it blank to use the bank statement entry description. Then our other fields is our standard fields, our AP source code that we might want to select. This is all our source codes in Cashbook. Our account code, that is the account code that the entry should be assigned on the Cashbook batch entry detail line. Distribution code. Now the distribution code is important to use on your rule if you want to generate a Cashbook batch entry with multiple detail lines that is going to be split across multiple GL accounts. So in your distribution code in Cashbook, when you go and look at your distribution codes, you can set up a distribution code with multiple lines in the distribution code, and you can set up the GL accounts, source codes, etc. in the distribution code lines, as well as the amount of that distribution code line. And the bank statement entry will then be split up into a Cashbook batch entry with multiple detail lines according to those distribution code detail lines that you set up. A good example will be if you are paying a medical aid and you are paying one amount to your medical aid, but you're paying it for 5 of your employees. You can then split that bank statement payment that goes off to the medical aid by setting up a distribution code for your medical aid, and then in the distribution lines you can either set the amount for each line, or you can even, in the Cashbook distribution codes, it does support a percentage breakdown where you can break down the lines as a percentage of the bank statement entry amount, and then allocate for those 5 employees their particular medical aid contribution in the actual Cashbook batch entry detail line. So that's when you would use the distribution code on your rule, to take a bank statement entry and to create multiple detail lines for that entry that's been generated to the Cashbook batch, and split the lines according to those distribution code lines that you've set up. Our comments field, that's just the comments field in the Cashbook batch. What do you want to populate to that field? And then if it is a tax tracking bank that you've set up in Cashbook and you select the tax tracking yes for the bank, then of course all the tax tracking information that you set up in tax services, you can then select for your particular Cashbook batch entry detail line, so that when this rule is applied to the entry, it knows exactly what tax calculation should take place when that entry is generated to the Cashbook batch. So you've got your tax groups, your tax types, your tax class, whether that's tax inclusive or exclusive, all your tax. It will then do your tax calculation for you according to your tax rates that you set up in tax services, and it will, when you then post that entry in the Cashbook batch, update your tax tracking report in tax services, and obviously it will then also update the tax account in the GL with the tax portion of the entry that has been calculated. And then we have our entry type. And at entry type, we can, as we can in the Cashbook batch, select whether it's a Cashbook entry type, accounts payable, or accounts receivable. Now, if it's a Cashbook entry type, then optionally, you can add a miscellaneous code that you've set up in Cashbook to attach to the Cashbook batch entry that's generated. If it's accounts payable or accounts receivable, then it's compulsory to enter your vendor or customer code that particular accounts payable or accounts receivable entry should be generated for. And then once you set up your customer or vendor code, then you can select how that accounts payable and accounts receivable entry should be allocated against that customer or vendor account when the entry is generated to the Cashbook batch. And let's quickly run through our allocation options. The first few options here, the first three, is auto allocate, which means that we want to start allocating against the invoices that are outstanding in that customer or vendor account. And you can select three auto allocate options. You can do it by document number, where it will take and sort the customer or vendor account by document number, and it will allocate against the first outstanding document number, and then once it's applied the outstanding amount of that invoice, it will pick up the next document number and start allocating against that document number, and so it will allocate to each document number until the bank statement entry amount has been completely allocated. You can also do it by document date, which will then sort the documents by date and allocate to those entries according to date. And then you can also use due date. So in accounts payable, for instance, you might have a due date for those invoices that have been generated in accounts payable, and you might have discounts that have been set up that you can qualify for if you pay by that due date. So you might want to allocate according to due date in order for you to realize those discounts that apply to those invoices. So then you can select due date, and it will then apply to the first outstanding due date, and then according to due date to the next invoices. You can also select prepay, which means it's not going to do an allocation, it's just going to create a prepayment entry. And you can then, once you've posted the prepayment entry, go through the apply document mode, pick up the prepayment entry, and allocate the prepayment yourself. The equal amount option, it will take the bank statement entry amount and it will run through the outstanding documents in that customer vendor account, and the first outstanding document that matches the bank statement entry amount, it will allocate against that document. And then the document number option, if you have clients that are paying you via internet banking, this is an example I'm using, and the invoice number that you've invoiced them, they use that invoice number as the reference that they're sending through to your bank statement when they do the payment to you. You can then use this document number allocation option. And the way it works is it will pick up the customer or the vendor account, and it will pick up the first outstanding document number, and it will then search in the bank statement entry description for that document number to see if it can find it anywhere in the bank statement entry description. If it cannot, it will pick up the next document number in the customer vendor account, and it will search in the bank statement entry description for the next document number until it finds a document number that it can find in the bank statement entry description, and it will then allocate against that particular document number in the customer vendor account. Now, if it doesn't find any document number in the bank statement entry description that matches a document number in the customer vendor account, and you've selected the document number option, it will then generate a prepayment entry for you, and it will give you a very clear message that that particular entry number in the batch was generated as a prepayment entry because it could not find a document number match. The same with the equal amount. If there's no outstanding document in the customer or vendor that matches the amount of the bank statement entry, it will give you a message that a prepayment entry was generated. Similarly with your auto allocate options here, if it allocates according to your auto allocate that you've selected, and it's allocated against all the outstanding documents for a particular customer or vendor account, but the bank statement entry amount hasn't been completely depleted. In other words, there's still a surplus amount in hand after it's allocated against all the documents. And then it will create a prepayment entry of the entire bank statement entry. It won't partly allocate for you, and it will tell you that that customer or vendor balance, outstanding balance, was less than the bank statement entry amount, and therefore a prepayment entry is generated. You can then go and generate the other invoices that should be allocated against, and then pick up the prepayment entry through the apply document mode and go and allocate them once you've generated those additional invoices. So those are your allocate options. And then finally in the rule, we can also select optional fields. Yes, Maslin.
Which one would you recommend is the most suitable allocation method then?
It would really depend on the particular customer or vendor account, but I would imagine the one that is most commonly used would be the auto allocate by document number, because that would work like on a balance brought forward system where it just starts allocating at the first outstanding document number, and it will then run through and it will allocate according to the first document number and keep allocating until it's depleted the bank statement entry amount. So if they work on a balance brought forward system, they would want to use either the document number or the document date. But of course, in those scenarios where they actually have an invoice number coming through on their bank statement, then it's going to be very useful to use the document number option. And similarly, if they want to match by amount and they know that that particular bank statement entry is the exact amount of an invoice sitting in the customer or vendor account, then they would want to use the equal amount option. But if your clients are using balance brought forward, then I would say, which is in a lot of cases would be the case, then you use your auto allocate by document number or by document date.
Okay, all right.
Okay. Then in your optional fields, because Cashbook supports optional fields, you can then select an optional field if you want to generate an optional field for that Cashbook batch entry. And your optional fields you can select on the batch header and the batch detail. So any Cashbook optional fields that you have set up in Cashbook, you can then select as an optional field that should be generated for the entry when it's generated through to the Cashbook batch. And then finally in our rules template, we also have a category maintenance tab. And in the category maintenance tab, we have given you the ability to seamlessly move an existing rule from one category to another. So we can select an existing category. Let's say, for instance, we have a category called deposits, and we've set up all our rules for our category deposits. But because that category has become very big and cumbersome, because it's got so many rules now, we've decided to create another category called AR. And in the category AR, we specifically want deposit entries that are going to be allocated against customer accounts in accounts receivable, and not just deposits that are going to go through to a GL account in the GL. We now set up a category AR, and now we want to move those AR deposits from the category deposits to our AR category. You can then just select that particular rule, hit the arrow, and it will move that rule across to the category AR. So it's important to remember that you never have to delete an existing rule because you want to move it to a different category. You can come to the category here, and you can move it seamlessly from one category to another. And that then concludes our rules template setup. Now that we've set up the rules template, when we select that rules template, RecXpress will know two things. First of all, it will know which bank format we're going to be importing. And secondly, it's going to know all the rules that should be applied to our bank statement entries when the bank statement is imported. And let's go and do that next. So for that, we go to our RecXpress transaction menu item, and we go to our RecXpress import. And in this RecXpress bank statement import form, we can then import the bank statement for a particular bank code in Cashbook. Now, we also have under the RecXpress transaction menu item a import multiple RecXpress, where you can set up multiple bank statement imports for your various bank codes in Cashbook. So if you've got a client that has got 50 banks that they've set up in their Cashbook, and they're using RecXpress on all 50 of their banks, to save them having to sit there and import each bank statement for each bank code separately, you can then come into your multiple RecXpress import, and you can set up all the criteria we're going to go through now. When we go back to our bank statement import screen, you can then set up here in this grid. And if you select import yes, when you hit the import button here, it will then import all the bank codes, bank statements that you have set up in this grid, which means that the user can have 50 lines in this grid for their 50 bank codes, pointing to their 50 bank statements, and before they leave the office at night, they can hit the import button, and they can go off, and the next morning when they come back, it would have imported all their bank statements for all their various bank codes in Cashbook that's been set up in this grid, and they can then just proceed to their reconciliation in RecXpress. So let's see what we have to set up before we then import the bank statement. The first thing is the bank code. So we will select the actual bank code in Cashbook that we're going to be importing the bank statement for. The second field is our rules template. And you can see I didn't actually select that field. It was automatically populated. Why is that? Because once you selected the rules template, it will then remember what rules template was associated to this particular bank code. And it will then automatically retrieve that rules template. So it's only the very first time that you have to select it. If you change it, of course, then it will associate the new rules template that you've selected to this particular bank code. It just saves the user from having to select that field every time and remembering which rules template belongs to that particular bank code. So it automatically associates it to the bank code. Then when we look at the next field here, we can see it's a current statement date field. And that is currently blank, as well as the last statement date field. Now the reason those fields are blank at the moment is because we have not imported a bank statement for this particular bank code as yet. As soon as we import the bank statement, it will take the very latest bank statement entry date for that bank statement that we've imported, and it will update the current statement date with that particular bank statement entry date. The next time you import a bank statement for this bank code, it will then move that current statement date to your last statement date, and once again it will update your current statement date with the latest bank statement entry date for that bank statement. Now why do we do that? We do that so that when the user imports the next bank statement, they know exactly up to which date they've imported the bank statement for previously for this particular bank code, so that they don't import the bank statement again for dates that they've already imported the bank statement for. In the remarks field, that's purely user defined, whatever remarks they want to put in there about their RecXpress bank reconciliation. And then we have a few options here that we can select, and let's run through them, because these options will affect how the automated reconciliation takes place when we import the bank statement. The first option is clear existing recon data. Now that clear existing recon data will perform exactly the same function as this clear button that is grayed out at the moment. That clear button is only disabled because we haven't imported a bank statement as yet. As soon as we import a bank statement, it will be enabled. When you select that clear button, it will remove all the bank statement entries that have been imported into RecXpress for this particular bank code. That is what the clear button does. So if you imported the wrong bank statement for this particular bank code, then you can hit the clear button and it will clear out those bank statement entries. Now, why do we have a clear existing recon data option? It does exactly the same as the clear button, but it does it in conjunction with your bank statement import. So that when you select the clear existing recon data option, it will automatically clear out the previous bank statement entries that have been imported before the next period's bank statement entries are imported. It just saves the user from having to remember to clear the previous bank statement period's entries that have been imported and to automate it with the import bank statement function, where it will automatically then clear the existing bank statement entries before it imports the new bank statement entries. Now, if you select that option, you can see there's a second option here, clear only posted entries, that works in conjunction with that option. So it only becomes available if you select clear existing recon data. And then you can select clear only posted entries. Clear only posted entries means when the existing bank statement entries are cleared before the next period's bank statement entries are imported, only clear out the bank statement entries that were in the previous period successfully reconciled to Cashbook entries and that were posted through to the Cashbook bank reconciliation. So it will leave behind any bank statement entries that were not reconciled against Cashbook entries and that was not posted through to the Cashbook bank reconciliation. Because typically those would be the entries that you would want to remain, because those are the entries you would now reconcile in the current period. So that's your clear only posted entries option. Match amounts. When the bank statement is imported, it will take all the references of the bank statement entries and it will cycle through the Cashbook bank reconciliation, and it will, for that particular bank code, see if any of the references of the bank statement entries can be matched to references in the Cashbook bank reconciliation. Now, when you do payments, then that reference number match works very well to reconcile the bank statement entry to the Cashbook entry by using that reference. Because if you do a payment, you would have a check number that's sitting in your Cashbook for that Cashbook entry, and that same check number will appear on your bank statement, and those two reference numbers will then be reconciled against each other by using that check number. But of course, for your receipts and your deposits, that's a different story, because you are not going to know which reference is going to appear on your bank statement when you process your Cashbook receipt or deposit. So for those receipts and deposits where the reference number of the Cashbook entry will not match the reference number of the bank statement entry, for those you can then select the match amounts option. And RecXpress will then, once it's done the reference number reconciliation, it will do a second reconciliation process if you've selected match amounts. And for those entries that it could not reconcile by reference, it will then reconcile by amount. And by doing that, it takes the automated reconciliation that much closer to 100% automated reconciliation. Because now you can automatically reconcile your payments as well as your deposits. Match unreconciled only. Now before we get to match unreconciled only, let's just look at this later than statement transaction date that works in conjunction with our match amounts. If you select match amounts, you can see you can also select this later than statement transaction date. What does that mean? A default to on. If you select that later than statement transaction date option, it means match the amounts of the bank statement entries to any of the entries in the Cashbook Bank reconciliation, regardless of whether that Cashbook entry date is earlier, equal to, or later than the statement transaction date. If I toggle it off, it will only match the amounts to Cashbook entries with the same or earlier date than the bank statement entry date. Okay, and the reason we've given you that option is because a lot of RecXpress users have said that they always enter their Cashbook entries first. So the bank statement entry will always have the same date or a later date than the Cashbook entry that needs to be reconciled against. So in that scenario, you can leave that off, and that match amount will then only match to Cashbook batch entries that have the same date and an earlier date, and it won't match the amount of the bank statement entry to Cashbook entries of the same amount that have a later date than the statement transaction date. The match unreconciled only, that is if you only want to reconcile the bank statement entries to Cashbook entries that have an unreconciled status. In other words, you don't want to match against Cashbook entries that have already been reconciled in the Cashbook Bank reconciliation. Now you might ask, why is that even an option? Because in most cases, you would always want to only reconcile your bank statement entry against a Cashbook entry that's unreconciled. Because why would you want to match against the entry that's already been reconciled? Now the answer to that is, and why we have included that option is, there are some RecXpress and Cashbook users that are fanatical about preventing duplicate reference numbers on their bank statements and in their Cashbooks. So if they leave that match unreconciled only off, they still want to know if a particular reference number that's already been reconciled in the Cashbook is appearing on the bank statement again. So it wants it to still reconcile against that bank statement entry so that it can see that that particular bank statement reference has appeared on the bank statement again, although it has already been reconciled against the Cashbook entry. And that is to prevent any duplicate numbers so they can pick up that a duplicate number has come through on their bank statement. But in most cases, you would leave it as match unreconciled only. Match with error. When the entries of the bank statement are matched to the Cashbook entries by reference number, if the amount of the bank statement entry is different to the amount of the Cashbook entry, then that entry will be reconciled in error, and we call that a matched with error entry, where the reference numbers are the same but the amounts are different. And it will display that for you in your RecXpress reconciliation in a separate display with the variance amount between the Cashbook entry amount and the bank statement entry amount. That is what match with error means. If you toggle it on, that's what would happen. It will match it in error, the status will be matched in error, and it will show you the variance amount. If you switch it off, it means that it will not match an entry in error. If the reference number of the bank statement entry matches the reference number of the Cashbook entry, and the amount is not the same of the bank statement entry to the Cashbook entry, then it will not match it. It will put it as a no match entry instead of matching it with error. Now the reason we've added that is there are some bank statements that have a lot of duplicate reference numbers. credit card statements that I've seen is a pointing case where you want to reconcile your credit card statement, but there's a lot of replication of duplicate reference numbers. If you then switch off the match with error, it will only match the entry if the reference number and the amount of the entry is the same. So all those duplicate reference numbers, it won't match the first reference number that matches. It will leave it as an unmatched entry until it finds an entry where the reference and the amount is the same, and it will only match those entries. It won't match that in error. So that's the match with error.
Mike?
Yes, Alna.
When you select match with error, when it picks up the duplication reference or duplicate amount, will that will basically allow you then to manually reconcile that entry?
Correct. It will leave it as a no match entry, and when we go to the RecXpress reconciliation next, you'll see that you'll be able to pick up that no match entry on your bank statement, in the top grid, which is your bank statement grid, and then reconcile it against the Cashbook entry that you select manually.
So basically it will just say reconciled with error on your actual on your recon list, and then you will then be able to override that.
Okay, so if you leave it on match with error, it will show you in a separate display in RecXpress. We call it the match with error display. It will list all the entries with the same reference number but different amounts. And then what it will do is it will allow you to generate an adjustment entry to bring the entry amounts in line with each other. Or you could then select to unreconcile the entry if you've decided that this entry should not be reconciled. That's if you leave match with error on. If you leave it off, if the reference number and the amount wasn't exactly the same, it won't match it in error. Even if the reference number is the same but the amount is different, it will leave it as a no match entry and it won't reconcile it against any Cashbook entry. Okay. Then our matched by. We've got a drop down in our match by, and here we can select when that automated reconciliation takes place, on which fields we want that reconciliation to take place. Now it defaults to reference number, so if you leave it as reference, then it will go through the reference number automated reconciliation, and then it will check if you've got match amounts, and if you've got that selected, it will do a second automated reconciliation by amount by the ones that couldn't match by reference. You can select reference description, which means first do a reconciliation by reference, and then for those entries that could not be reconciled by reference, then do a reconciliation by the description of the Cashbook entry to the description of the bank statement entry. If you select description only, it means don't do a match by reference number, but use the Cashbook description of that Cashbook entry to match the description of the bank statement entry. And then of course you could also do an automated reconciliation where it reconciles by description field first, and then if it could not reconcile by description, then use the reference field. So those are all the options you can set on determining which fields and in which order should be used in the automated reconciliation. Then we have these totals here. And these totals, as you can see, is 0 at the moment. Let's run through them and see what they are, because as soon as we input our bank statement, they will all be updated. That CV bank balance at the top is your actual Cashbook bank balance for this bank code. Imported amount will be updated with the net amount of all the entries imported. Payment entries will be deducted, deposit entries will be added. It will arrive at a net total of all the bank statement entries imported, and it will update the imported total. The match total are all the entries on the bank statement that were successfully reconciled against entries in the Cashbook. That is your match total. Your unmatched total are all the entries on the bank statement that could not be reconciled against a Cashbook entry. Matched with error, that's of course if you've selected the match with error option here. If you have, the matched with error total will give you the total of all the entries that were matched by reference, but the amounts were different. It will then take each of those entries that were matched with error, and it will take the variance amount, the difference between the Cashbook amount and the bank statement amount for each entry, and it will add all the variance amounts of all the entries matched with error together, and it will give you a total of the matched with error variance amounts. Previously reconciled, those are entries on the bank statement that have already been reconciled previously in the Cashbook. And then of course your bank balance here is your current bank balance in your Cashbook bank reconciliation. The script file name here, you can select the browse button and you can then point to the location that you've downloaded your bank statement file to on your system when you download it from the bank's website. So this is where you would point to the bank statement file that should be imported. If you're using sample data, which is what we're using today, leave it blank because we use the file import export function to import our Excel sample bank statement file that we've set up for the sample data. So for our purposes, we'll leave it blank. In practice, you would use the browse button and point to the actual bank statement. Select the import button, hit OK, and it now imports our bank statement. Now when the bank statement is imported, two processes take place. The first process that takes place is it will cycle through all the rules that we've set up in the rules template. And it will check the identification criteria in every rule and see if any of the bank statement entries meet the identification criteria of any of the rules. If it does, it will assign the rule to that bank statement entry. If it does not find any rule that applies to that particular bank statement entry, then it puts it in the category Other. Then it goes through a second process, and that process is then the automated reconciliation that takes place, where it will then do a reconciliation of the bank statement entries by reference to the Cashbook entries, and because we selected amount, it will then do a second reconciliation process of those entries it could not reconcile by reference and reconcile them by amount. And now we can see all our totals have been updated here. Also, our bank balance has now been updated as well. And you can see your bank balance would be your imported, which is your total imported entries, and your current bank balance. So you are working towards this new bank balance, because if all the entries that you've just imported via your bank statement was reconciled to Cashbook entries, then that is your new bank statement balance. And your RecXpress button has now become enabled, and you can then proceed to your RecXpress reconciliation. Now when you select the RecXpress button, you will see all the bank statement entries that have been imported, and each of those bank statement entries will have an import status that has been assigned to them based on the outcome of that automated reconciliation that took place. So you can see here in the import status, each and every bank statement entry with the import status assigned to them. And we're going to go through those import statuses one by one. But before we do that, I just want to scroll to the right of our reconciliation here. Now you can see this is all our bank statement entries we're looking at. The reference, the statement date, the year period, the import amount, and if we scroll further to the left, you will now see the rules that have been applied to our bank statement entries according to that rules template that we've set up. Here's our rules category. If it's got an auto numbering sequence, what the auto numbering sequences are, and then of course what transaction type it is, and if it's AP or AR, what customer vendor should be allocated against. So there's all your rules applied to the entries. Now you can also select how you want to display these bank statement entries. So you can select the sort sequence. Under your drop down here, sort by, you can sort by bank statement reference, bank statement date, the bank statement entry amount, the Cashbook reference, that is the Cashbook reference that has been reconciled against for that bank statement entry. So you can also sort by the Cashbook reference. If your particular bank format has a statement number field, you can also sort by that statement number field. You can sort by transaction codes, which will place all the transaction codes that are the same together. And you might want to do that if you decide that you are going to be setting up your rules in your reconciliation, and you now want to sort by transaction codes, because typically the transaction codes that are the same are the entries that will belong to the same rules category. So it makes it easier then to set up your rules if it is sorted by transaction code. The GL account code, the GL account code is the GL account that has been assigned to the bank statement entry when the rule was applied to the bank statement entry. So you can sort by that GL account, and then you can also sort by the rules category to then sort all those entries to which rules could be applied by those rules categories. Once you've selected your sort sequence, you can then select your sort order, ascending or descending, and then you can also select to display only a particular category. So if you only want to display adjustments, or only accounts payable entries, accounts receivable entries, or only bank charges entries, only checks, you can then display that only that particular category. Now that category other that I referred to earlier, you might want to display that category other only. And the reason being, the category other will have all the bank statement entries to which no rule could be applied because that bank statement entry did not meet the identification criteria of any of the rules that you set up in your rules template. These are then typically the entries that you want to allocate rules to, so that the next time you import the bank statement, they won't be placed in the category other, but the rule will be applied to them and they would be placed in that particular rules category. So you can do that from here for any of your entries that have been imported. You can then go to your category here, and you can drill down to any of your categories from here in your rules template to look at any of the categories of your rules that's been applied to the entry. In our case, because we're in category other here, we are now going to change our category other, and we're going to assign a category to this entry. Let's say stop order, for example. As soon as we select stop order and we tab off, it will say you have changed the category from other to stop order. Do you want to add this entry to category stop order in your default template? So what it's telling us is this category information and the rule information that we're going to be setting up for this particular entry. Do we want to save it to the template and create a rule in the template so the next time that this entry is imported, the rule can be applied to the entry? Now, if you say yes, it will then take you through each of the fields in the rule exactly the same as if you were in the rules template and allow you to set up the rule and save the rule. If you select no, it will allow you to set up the information because you might want to generate that entry only once and not save it to your template, and you want to set up the information on how it should be generated, and then it won't save it to the rules template. Now once you've done that, and I'm just going to change it back to category other there, but once you've now set up your rule and you've saved it to the template, you can then select your refresh button here at the bottom. At the bottom right of the screen, next to your close button, there's a refresh button. Now let me explain what that refresh button does. Remember when I explained the two processes that took place when we imported our bank statement entries? All the rules are cycled through and assigned to the bank statement entries, and the automated reconciliation takes place. Now when you select that refresh button, it does exactly those two processes again. Only difference being, it won't import any new bank statement entries. So what it will do is it will use the existing bank statement entries that has already been imported, and it will perform those two processes again. It will reapply all the rules, and it will redo the automated reconciliation. So if you've now assigned rules to these entries in category others and you hit the refresh button, it will then move all those entries out of the category other into their own categories and apply the rules to them. And similarly, you might have imported your bank statement and you might have seen, but there are some Cashbook entries that should have been reconciled against, but they have not been. And you go to your Cashbook and you realize there's unposted batches sitting in your Cashbook that should have been posted before you did that automated reconciliation when you imported the bank statement. You can then post those Cashbook batches, and then you can hit the refresh button here, and it will then redo the automated reconciliation for you. And of course now, those new entries that have been added to the Cashbook bank reconciliation because those batches have been posted will then be included in the automated reconciliation. So that's what the refresh button does. Okay, for our purposes, we're now going to clear and not only display category other, and then refresh our reconciliation, display all our bank statement entries. Also, we have a tick box at the top, Show Cashbook. If we select that tick box, it will display a second grid on the screen for you, and that bottom grid is your Cashbook transactions. So the top grid remains your bank statement entries, and as you scroll through your top grid, it will call up the Cashbook entry in the bottom grid that particular bank statement entry that you've got focus on in the top grid has been reconciled against. Now let's look at our import statuses that have been assigned to our entries when that automated reconciliation took place. At the moment, you can see we have a variety of import statuses in our import status field being displayed. The reason for that is because in our drop-down at the top, we've selected display all bank statement entries. Now we can select to display the bank statement entries based on that import status. So let's look at correctly matched first. Correctly matched will display all the entries with an exact match import status. An exact match import status means that the reference of the bank statement entry was matched to the reference of the Cashbook entry, and the amount of the bank statement entry was matched to the amount of the Cashbook entry. So you have complete peace of mind that the correct bank statement entry was reconciled against the correct Cashbook entry because it's 100% matched by reference and amount. The next display is the matched with error. And in the matched with error, because we selected the match with error option, it will display all the entries with the same reference number on the bank statement that's been matched against the same reference number in Cashbook, but the bank statement entry amount is different to the Cashbook entry amount. It is then reconciled in error, and there's our variance amount. And in this matched with error display, you will see there is a batch button that you can use. And that batch button you can then use to generate an adjustment of that variance amount to bring the Cashbook entry in line with the bank statement entry amount. The next one is our matched amount. The matched amount means that the reference of the bank statement entry is different to the reference of the Cashbook entry. But because we selected match amount, it has matched the amount of the bank statement entry to the amount of the Cashbook entry. and reconcile the two entries against each other by amount. Once again, in the match amount display, you have peace of mind that the correct bank statement entry was reconciled against the correct Cashbook entry. The reason I say that is because it will only be assigned a matched amount import status if there was only one Cashbook entry that matched the amount of the bank statement entry. So as we scroll through our bank statement entries in the top grid, you can see that there's only one Cashbook entry that is called up in the bottom grid, because only one Cashbook entry matched the amount of that bank statement entry. Then our next display is more than one amount. More than one amount is where it could not be matched by reference, so it was matched by amount, but it found more than one Cashbook entry amount that could be matched to the bank statement entry amount. Now, when it does that match by amount and there's more than one amount, it will display all the Cashbook entries with the same amount in the bottom grid for you. And the entry it would have selected is the entry with the closest date to the actual bank statement entry date. So you can see all these entries have the same amount, but that entry was selected, and we can tell that by looking at the entry that's got a yes in the used column, and that entry was reconciled against that entry. Why? Because their dates are the same, and that's why I didn't choose any of the other entries. So even in this display, 99% of the time it's going to select the correct entry to match against because it takes the date into consideration. Now, if you want to reconcile against another entry because you might decide that that was not the correct entry that was reconciled against, you can do that by then unreconciling the entry here by clicking in this used column and changing the yes to no. You can see it's now a no match entry, and that entry is unreconciled, and then selecting another entry and just clicking that no to a yes, and then reconciling another entry to that bank statement entry. So the user can still fine-tune the reconciliation. They don't have to accept the entry that was selected by RecXpress. And of course the other entries you see here all have used in the used column, which means they were reconciled against other bank statement entries based on the same criteria, that the amount was the same and that particular Cashbook entry had a closer date to the other bank statement entry. And then finally we have our no match, and in the no match is where the Cashbook entries could not be matched against the bank statement entry. So these are all the bank statement entries to which it could not find a Cashbook entry to match against. And this is the entries that we would typically want to generate through to a Cashbook batch, because those entries are on the bank statement, but they do not exist in the Cashbook. They could not be matched to entries in the Cashbook. And that is why it's in this no match display that you have the batch button to generate those entries with the allocation details that the rules apply to the entry through to the Cashbook batch. But before we do that, there's one other reconciliation scenario we have to cover before we generate our entries through from our bank statement to the Cashbook batch for those no match entries. And that is where you have more than one Cashbook entry that you want to reconcile to a bank statement entry, or more than one bank statement entry you want to reconcile to a Cashbook entry. Or you might have many Cashbook entries that you want to reconcile to many bank statement entries. And the way you do that is you do that by selecting your mode at the top as multiple. If you select the multiple mode, you can now select a multiple match ID by clicking here on the multiple match ID, and it will then assign a multiple match ID for you. And in that multiple match ID, you can see we're going to have a bank total, a Cashbook total, a variance amount if the amounts of the Cashbook entries and bank statement entries aren't the same yet, the amount of bank entries selected to reconcile, and the amount of Cashbook entries. So let's do that quickly. We're going to select this particular bank statement entry to reconcile against these two Cashbook entries that we see in the comments field. So we select our first bank statement entry. You can see our bank total has been updated and we've selected one bank entry. Now we go to our Cashbook entries and we select those two Cashbook entries. There's our first Cashbook entry, and you can see we now have a Cashbook entry as well, and we now have a amount in the Cashbook total. But we have a variance amount because the one Cashbook entry and the one bank statement entry aren't the same amount as yet, until we then select our second Cashbook entry. And now we don't have a variance amount because our Cashbook entry total and our bank statement entry total matches. And we've now reconciled two Cashbook entries against one bank statement entry. Now if we want to do it for another entry, we can then select multiple match ID again. Our variance, you can see there is 0, so we've perfectly matched. And it will generate the next multiple match ID. And in this case, we're going to select these 1, 2, 3, 4 entries, and we're going to reconcile these 4 bank statement entries against one Cashbook entry. So we're going to be picking up our bank statement entries. There's our first entry, our second entry, our third entry, and our fourth entry. We have our 4 bank entries with our bank total, and now we're going to select our Cashbook entry, and this is the Cashbook entry, and we select that, and once again our variance is 0, and we've matched the 4 bank statement entries against the one Cashbook entry. And finally, we are going to do a third multiple match to match one bank statement payment amount against 4 Cashbook checks. So we're going to be selecting our first Cashbook check, that would be that one, 48990, then 48897, then 34908, and finally 34909. And look, our variance is 0, and we have now done 3 multiple matches where we've matched multiple bank statement entries to Cashbook entries and vice versa. Now that we've completed that multiple match, we are now ready to generate these entries, the no match entries that have not been matched. And for that we go back to single mode, and to generate these no match entries through to our Cashbook batch, all you have to do is in the no match display, in the select for batch column, you've got to make sure that you've got yes selected for batch. You can switch them all off and then toggle them on individually, or you can of course switch them all on and then toggle them off if you wish. For our purposes, we're going to select them all and we're going to hit the batch button. Are you sure you want to create a Cashbook batch of the selected entries? We say yes. It goes through a validation process to ensure that the entries that you have selected for batch has valid details attached to them. If it finds an entry that's been selected for batch that doesn't have valid details, it will give you a clear message on what detail is missing. In our case, GL account code cannot be blank, and it will locate that entry for you automatically. You see it's jumped to that entry, and we can now enter our GL account and hit the batch button again. If it finds another entry, it will jump to that entry. We can enter that GL account and hit the batch button. And now that all the entries are validated correctly and has valid details, it will then generate that Cashbook batch for us. We can then from here select our batch list in Cashbook. We don't have to leave the reconciliation. And in the batch list, we'll immediately see in our description that that was a RecXpress batch. And in our entry type, it will say RecXpress. And we can now post that Cashbook batch that's been generated from the bank statement entries. And when that Cashbook batch is posted to Cashbook, it will reconcile all those entries that have been generated back to the bank statement entry that it was generated from. It stands to reason that we know in RecXpress which entry to reconcile that Cashbook entry again, because we generated it directly off the bank statement entry. So now if you return to your no match, you can see there's no entries in the no match display any longer, and all those entries are now incorrectly matched because they've correctly been matched back to the entry that they were generated from on the bank statement. All that remains now for us is to do our adjustment amount for that entry that we matched in error, and for that all we do is go to our matched with error. Once again, in the select for batch, we say yes. We hit the batch button. Are you sure you want to create a Cashbook batch with the variance amount of the selected entries matched in error? If we say yes, it will then create an adjustment batch with that variance amount, and we can immediately identify the adjustment batch because it will say RecXpress variance batch in the description, and in the entry type it will say RecXpress adjustment. We can then post that entry through, and once we've posted that entry through, it will then remove it from the matched with error display because it's no longer matched with error, and it will put it in the many CB to one bank entry display. There's our original bank statement entry, there's our original Cashbook entry it was reconciled against in error, and there's our adjustment amount to bring the Cashbook entry amount in line with the bank statement entry amount. And now we're ready to post our reconciliation through to Cashbook. For that, we post RecXpress, we select the Post RecXpress button, and at this point, if we select the Post RecXpress button, this is when it will prompt you, are you sure that you want to update the Cashbook and RecXpress history with the imported reconciliation? If you then select yes, it will then, based on the reconciliation that took place in RecXpress now, update the Cashbook bank reconciliation with that reconciliation and reconcile the Cashbook entries accordingly. And it will update your reconciliation history. So if we now close, we will now see that our bank balance and our Cashbook bank balance are now in line. We've reconciled all the bank statement entries that we've imported in our Cashbook against our bank statement balance. And our new Cashbook bank balance is the same as our bank balance that was updated when we imported the bank statement entries. And for future reference, you can go to your RecXpress history. You never ever have to look at your bank statements again that you filed away. You can go here and open that particular reconciliation that took place in RecXpress history, and it will show you the exact reconciliation that took place at the time. And of course, for our multiple matches that we had, if you click here in the ID column, it will show you the exact bank statement entry and the multiple Cashbook entries, or if it was the other way around, that it was reconciled against. So you always have your history there to show what reconciliations took place in RecXpress to your Cashbook entries. And that then concludes the training. So thank you very much for taking the time again. If there's any questions, fire away. I'm happy to answer them.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike.
No questions from me. Thank you, Mike.
You're welcome, Asleen. Thank you guys for taking the time, and I'm going to see you both on Thursday for the EFT Express training.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks for your time.
Great. Thank you to you too. Keep
Thank
well.
you, Mike. Have a good evening.
You too.
Have a good evening.
You too. Bye.